Well, hello, everyone. Recording is in progress, and this means that I need to behave myself from this point forward. So for those of you in the future listening to this recording, thanks for coming. We're getting started on a question that we call a wisdom question or a disputed question. And the first one of our series is, what is classical education? We're not the only people asking this question by any means, but this group here that you're going to get to meet are some folks who've been involved in classical education for some time and have been thinking about what it is and how it might be recovered and implemented. We're going to talk about this phrase, classical education, and why it's being used, and it's maybe some of the pros and cons of it. And I think right now everybody is able to view the broadcast. We have a number of people who are coming in, and so we just want to welcome people as they are actually signing on to the call. And that means we need to banter for about 5 minutes because, you know, people are putting dishes away, et cetera, and making their way to the computer. So we're gonna create a little 5-minute grace period. So I'll probably be introducing this, two different ways to kind of get us going. I'm Christopher Perrin. I work with Classical Academic Press. I'll be moderating and facilitating. And in a short while, we'll be introducing everybody that you see on this checkerboard. And there might be a couple others soon appearing. Well, we just want to start by opening up the chat box and doing some chatting. So if you know Zoom, you can open up the chat box. If you see it there on the black bar beneath, you just double click it or single click it, it will open up, and then you can start to see people. So let's just have some fun. And would you tell us your first name and where you are from, and what language you're interested in besides English? Maybe you even know another language besides English. Maybe English is your second language. So I'd just like to see what other language that you're interested in. So first name, where you are from, and a language that you've been interested in. Okay. Katie, French in all caps. And we have Joellen from Texas, interested in Mandarin, Russian, lots of Latin, studying Hebrew and Russian, Beth from Watertown. German and Japanese, Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and Spanish. Icelandic, John from Indiana, studying Icelandic. Jill, studying Hebrew and Latvian. Latin and Hebrew. Remarkable. There's stories behind each of these people. I want to talk to the person who's learning Icelandic or Icelandic.
But do you see who that is, though? That's John Ballsba.
Of course.
Yeah,
okay.
So I was wondering that too. I was like, who's studying Icelandic? And I was like, oh, hey, John, why isn't John should be on here with us? But greetings, John.
Thank you for coming. Well, great. As I said, we're bantering a little bit why people come in until about 7:05, and Carol McNamara has just joined us. Hi, Carol. Welcome. Carol's joining us, I think, from Phoenix. Am I right? Excellent.
There's also an AI assistant helping someone to take notes for this meeting, who's in the chat box.
That'll be our first question. We'll address the AI question in classical education. How about that?
Please, no.
Okay.
Hey,
let's hear from our panelists.
The person who's studying Latvian and Hebrew, if you haven't read Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik yet, you would really enjoy it.
Junius, you just made that person's night. That now he or she knows why they joined the call. Going to read a great novel, blending Hebrew and Latvian. There's some we have some eccentric interests as well, and so let's go while you're coming in. Let's do the same thing with the panel. So I'm going to go across the panel and let everyone introduce himself or herself. And I'm going to tell you what your order is. So it's going to be Jolie, Davies, Carrie, Chris, Martin, Brian, Junius, Christine, and Carol. If you would tell everybody, where you do your work, that would be interesting. And then, what prompted you to choose your course of study in college? What did you study in college as an undergraduate? And if you want to give like a 30-second little narrative of, why you changed your major 4 times, that would be okay. And here's Louis Markos. Welcome, Louis. So
Louis,
we cannot hear you, but you're probably working your way through the technology.
There we go. Sorry, I'm just so happy to be on there. Yeah, I think hopefully Chris is next. I just used the last one that was sent to the 2 of us.
Yay.
Good job. Quite a panel.
We're going to have some fun, and we have till 9 o'clock. So I will encourage everyone to relax. We'll have plenty of time to talk. And this is being recorded in case some of you have to get off the call and take care of some things domestically. So we're going to go around the checkerboard, and Louis, you'll be the last person to tell us who you are, where you work. And then we're interested in just hearing like a 30-second or 60-second narrative of what you chose to study in college as an undergraduate and why. So Jolie, we're starting with you.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Joelle Hodge. I work at Classical Academic Press. I had a double major in college. I had history and political science and pre-law. And I chose that in many ways because I thought I wanted to go into politics and into the legal profession and wanted to do some combination of both of those 2 things. But alas, the Lord had other plans, and I ended up doing neither law school nor working in politics for very long. All right.
And you didn't change your major?
I did not change. No,
okay.
I followed them through.
I think the average now is almost 10. So people do change their majors a lot, but not Jolie Hodge. She knew what she wanted to study. Davies, how about you?
Yeah, Davies Owens, part of the classical Christian world for about 23 years now. And I majored in sociology and minored in philosophy. And I would say that the driving force behind that, other than the fact that I had a sociology professor who was actually a former cop, so his idea of sociology was to meet him at 11 p.m. and ride in the cop car through downtown Greenville, South Carolina, where it's at Furman, to actually see and ask hard questions about why the world and society is set up the way it is. I thought that was fascinating. It was some classes in stats too, but the core for me has always been, how do we connect Christ and culture? And so often they're passing each other by. So the more I became fascinated with sociology, the more I thought about how do we leverage the gospel in the current cultural context, which I think about a lot. So sociology is still very much part of how I think, and philosophy, because I had a really L'Abri experience on actually a number of occasions. I've been to L'Abri, and I think Schaefer kind of helped me realize that you can be a thinking Christian. So I wanted to really embrace more philosophical understandings of the gospel and our faith. So more to be said later.
Thank you, Davies. And Chris Schlect, welcome from Moscow, Idaho. Not sure what time it is, but a little earlier for you than here in Pennsylvania. And Chris, we're just going around the horn, and you'll be after Louis Markos, and we're asking the question: who are you? Where do you work? And what did you choose to study in college as an undergraduate, and why? Carrie, you're next.
Hello, good evening. Davies, I really, really envy you that you went to L'Abri. I got to go there in a few years ago. I visited the one in Switzerland and had lunch there with some wonderful people, and that sounds delightful. But I live in Arkansas. I really don't have I work for no man. I work for myself, and I do some adjunct instructing for John Brown University, and I teach integrated humanities. And I've been in the classical Christian education movement for 24 plus years now, teaching teachers. I have my own consulting business, so that's what I do. Did I say I'm in Siloam Springs, Arkansas, and I actually started out at Baylor University as a history and art history major, and I transferred to John Brown University. And really, I I loved learning a lot, and I had a hard time deciding on a major. And I ended up choosing education because I liked everything. And I also chose education as a major because of a person. So there was a professor at John Brown University in the education department. Shout out to Dr. Sandy Van Thiel. And I loved her, and I went into education because of her. And she is still a close friend and mentor of mine. I am now in a doctoral program in humanities, getting the education that I really actually always wanted. So
Thank you, Carrie. Chris Hall.
So, Carrie, it's kind of funny. You said you're getting the education you always wanted. That's how I feel about the gardens and the workshop here. It's one of those things that's just an ongoing. I never earned my PhD. I stopped it by MAT, but there it was. Undergrad, let's see, Gettysburg College. I was a physics major at first, and then I transferred to philosophy. And when my advisor in physics asked me why, I said, because philosophy includes physics and everything else I want to study. And there it is. There was a lot of room over there in that department to go. And I bridged it. I loved it. My current work right now, I've been in, let's see, I had to think about it for a minute, Christian classical education now for 13 years. It's been a good while. I worked brick and mortar for a long time. I've spent time in public school, independent school, classical Christian schools. And now what I do is I primarily teach here on the homestead through Always Learning Education. And I teach through Scholect Academy and also Memoria Academy right now. I have a little bit of online teaching kind of spread across the board. Which runs everything from earth science to common arts. It's a strange life for someone who spent so much time in brick and mortar, but it's a beautiful time. And I think this is a kind of education that's coming into its own. I guess I would close this with one of my big questions right now is how do we do distance education like this classically? What are the ways that we can do this in a human way, a humanistic way, and also a way that imparts the best of the good, true, and beautiful, even through a medium like this? So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Chris. How about you, Martin?
Hey, Chris. Yeah, I start things, and then once they're running, I'm a living example of the Peter principle that you rise to your level of incompetence, and so then I get somebody who can actually run the entity, and so that's where we are right now. With Memoria College, which is my most recent project. I too am a philosophy major, so I feel so good being around all these other philosophy majors. I went to college and thought I needed to take a degree in something that would be useful. And so I became a business economics major. And on the side for fun, I was taking philosophy courses. And one day I realized I only needed to take one more in order to get the degree. So I declared the major and then I think took 3 classes. So that's been my background. And ironically, even in business, all the business things that I've been involved with, I went into banking for 6 years. And even in banking, the philosophy degree was more useful than the business economics degree. So that's my background. I think if there were any other questions in there. Davies, I don't know if you're from the Greenville area, but that's where my father's family's from, upstate.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Central.
Thank you, Martin. Brian.
Sure. Current gig is I'm Dean of the Templeton Honors College at Eastern University outside Philadelphia, and oversee 3 programs there, a high school program in the summer, an undergraduate Great Books program, and a Master of Arts in Classical Education. And then edit the academic journal of classical education called Principia. So that's what I do now. In undergrad, my major was in biblical literature. I wanted to study theology and thought I would do ministry probably. But I was TA for my New Testament professor who would have me lecture in his classes when he was away. So I found myself lecturing in Life of Christ and Book of Acts classes and just loved the classroom. And so I stuck, that was probably my first inclination that education was likely in my future. Though anytime I've worked in a church, I've been a kind of teaching pastor, and in schools, I'm often a pastoral teacher. So that's what I stayed with. And then I did a bunch of other degrees in theology and Christian ethics, but biblical literature, which also taught me how to read ancient texts, which has come in useful now and then. So.
Thank you, Brian. Junius.
Hey everybody, I'm Junius, and I have been teaching across the board for a number of years. I've taught in public school, I've taught in a small Christian co-op, I've been headmaster of a small Christian school, I've been a professor at Yale and at Baylor, and now I'm running my own business called Junius Johnson Academics, where I offer courses for adults and for children. I started off college as a theology major, theology specifically of missions. I wanted to be a missionary to France. And the first course that I took in my major at the beginning of my sophomore year, about halfway through the course, the professor called me into his office and told me that he thought I should change my major. And I thought, oh no, what have I done wrong? I thought I've been doing okay, you know. And he says, no, you've clearly been doing a lot of reading on your own. You got a lot of background. In my opinion, you kind of know what we want you to have for a BA in theology, and you're always talking about literature. And I think it would really round you out if you would go and do a degree in literature instead. And that love of literature came from my love of C.S. Lewis. And I was just I'd gotten to the end of what there was of Lewis to read, and so I was just reading Lewis's footnotes. And unbeknownst to me, I was giving myself a great books education by reading the books that Lewis talked about in his books. And so that's how I wound up getting my BA in English.
Thank you, Junius. And I hope you read one old book for every new book, following his advice.
At least.
Christine.
Hi, I'm Christine Perrin. We started the classical education journey 27 years ago. We had read about it somewhere, and then we heard someone came to our church and was talking about it. We sent our then oldest child, 6 years old, to a classical school, and Chris was asked to apply to be the headmaster, and just began to be involved year by year. I started teaching at Messiah University 25 years ago. While I was in graduate school at the University of Maryland. When I was an undergraduate, I started out in international relations, and then I moved to literature, but I especially appreciated teachers who were themselves writers teaching literature, because I found that their lives depended on these texts, the sinews, you know, the sentences, the syntax, it mattered so much to them. And what they gave me was the one that we were studying, instead of themselves and their own criticism. And that really was the fundament of my teaching about literature, and I would say about classical education too.
Thank you, Christine. Louis.
There we go. My name's Lou Markos. I'm an English professor at Houston Christian University, which used to be Houston Baptist University. I grew up in New Jersey, and I was one of those people. I went to public school, had a great high school English teacher who told me you should be an English professor. And so that just stuck. I went straight through. I went to Colgate University, which is upstate New York. And I knew I wanted to be an English professor, but I double majored in English and history. I had a love of ancient history and European history, but especially ancient history. I majored in the Romantics and Victorians and the classics. I didn't take any classes in Lewis and Tolkien because there weren't any classes in Lewis and Tolkien in the 1980s, though I was always reading those. I had actually never even really knew what a Christian university or school was. I always went to public schools. I went to University of Michigan for the master's and PhD, and then God led me down to Houston Baptist University. Never thought I would live down south. Never thought I would live in a big city. Never thought I'd be at a Christian school, but I really love it. And HBU has been trying to bring Athens and Jerusalem and being classical Christian since I've been there. So God put me at the right place, and I love working with all the CCE folks.
Thank you, Lou. Carol.
Hi, I am Carol McNamara. I am pretty new to the K-12 classical education world. I started as director of the Great Hearts Institute for Classical Education in November 2023. This is a new world for me, and I come to it from higher education. My undergraduate degree was in political science or political philosophy and French literature at the University of Toronto, and my PhD from Boston College also in political science and political philosophy. And I spent the greater part of my career, my day job was teaching political philosophy. But then the last 15 years, I started to work on various academic startups in Utah, Utah State University, Weber State University, and then at Arizona State University, I helped found the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership before I was recruited by Jake Tawney to join Great Hearts, where I am now in the midst of like really the biggest project probably I've ever taken on, but very excited to be in this world now.
And it's no surprise that you wrote on Socratic education, which was Carol's contribution to the disputed question. We'll get to that really soon after we hear from Chris. Chris from Moscow.
Yes, Christopher Moscow. I'm Chris Schlect, son of Edward Schlect, grandson of Earl Schlect. That is the Earl Schlect. And there you go. That says it all. I'm at New St. Andrews College. I've been at New St. Andrews College for a few decades now. I've been involved in classical Christian education for over 30 years. At New St. Andrews College today, I'm historian on the faculty, which was also my undergraduate major. That's what I majored in. And I serve on faculty as senior fellow of history. I'm also the head of the humanities department, and I direct a graduate program in classical and Christian studies at New St. Andrews. And I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you for your contributions. I printed them all out, read them, highlighted them, and I was joking with someone at Classical Academic that, we could just publish this, and maybe this is a great way to make books cheaply. And we could have AI do the editing, and maybe translate it into Chinese. This could be a really good thing. But actually, these are just thoughtful essays on the question, what is classical ed? And we've called it a disputed question or a wisdom question because you probably know when you ask this question, you get some varying answers. Not everyone answers this question the same way. And when this panel of people answered the question, you did see some variety. But I also noticed a theme. There's some things that were in common. I think showing that classical education is something that we can say has unity. We can talk about it from the perspective of what makes it a unified thing that we can even use the phrase. But as soon as we use the phrase, we're aware of multiplicity or variety, and that presents us with the old one and many dilemma. So I'd like to start with the question that kind of gets to this by asking this question: why do we even use the word or the phrase classical education today? Why is it that we keep using it? Because there might be an alternative.
Well, one of the reasons
we keep using it. So who would like to start?
Yeah, I'll jump in there. One of the reasons is because I think for most people in our country, when they think about education, the first thing that comes to mind is public school education. And public school education is built on a completely different DNA than the model of education that we're working from here. And so there's a need to distinguish what was fairly unanimous approach to the philosophy of education before the end of the 19th century and what replaced it. And classical is one way of referencing that older tradition.
So by way of contrast, therefore, what classical education is not is progressive education that came later. Similar, I've used the illustration, and others have too, of the new Coke. New Coke came along after they got rid of the old Coke, and then once because of the Pepsi challenge, those of you even know what I'm talking about. Pepsi came out with a sweeter flavor. People were choosing Pepsi over Coke. Coke needed to compete with Pepsi. They came out with a new Coke. All of the Coke fans went mad, and they said, "We want the old Coke back." And so they did release the old Coke again, and guess what they called it? Classical Coke. They called it Coke Classic, but they called it Classic. So do we call it classical education because something new came along? Is that the main reason we call it classical?
Yeah. Etymologically, I do think that's the origin of the term classical. In the 19th century, we start to see the adjective classical attached to the noun education. And it was in order to differentiate it from a new alternative. Prior to that time, you just had education. And then once you get industrialization and what we might call progressive education, but the new practical sort of be a cog in the economic machinery of society sort of education, when that vision arose and took vogue, they needed vocabulary to differentiate the old way of doing education over against the new alternative. And that's when we started using the adjective classical to refer to education. But then it referred preeminently to the culture and literature surrounding Greece and Rome. So it wouldn't have encompassed medieval education in the 19th century. That's a new development that emerges actually in the 1980s and 1990s.
So Chris, you're pointing out that there are multiple uses for this word or phrase. That sometimes even today you say, well, I really love classical education, and someone say, oh, so you really like the Greeks and the Romans. Is that what you're doing? You must be a historian, or you must be a classicist.
Yeah, I think Chris is right. I mean, this is where it gets confusing. And I know several of us have had conversations. I remember one with Martin and we must have been in Phoenix, and I was asking, is it useful to use the phrase classical education anymore? And we bandied about for a while. And I remember Martin saying some version of, well, it's kind of what everybody knows us by, and it's the best we have. But I do think, yeah, to Chris's point, there's the classical era of Greece and Rome. There are classicists, which are disciplinary specialists, which emerged from the early 19th century German research university, right? So that's the classicists. And then there's classical education. And I think Chris is right. We start using that term in the 19th century, both to differentiate it from education oriented towards job training and gainful employment, but also education that was adapting to new languages, like teaching French. That was a novel idea, and new sciences. And so there were lots of people saying, well, no, we need to stick with the classics. And Chris, I wonder though about your comment that it wouldn't have included the kind of medieval period, because there are late 19th century educators who refer to classical education, and they will refer to texts like Dante and texts and people like Aquinas in that tradition. I mean, for me, I think what we're talking about is another name for the long liberal arts tradition or liberal education. I mean, that's what it would have been known by early on in the late Roman, early Christian, early medieval, right? That's what we would have seen it called, probably.
Well, go ahead and weigh in, Louis.
Oh, when I speak at classical schools, I pretty much start with what Brian said there. I said classical education basically is liberal arts education when that phrase was used properly. And I actually use as an example how it used to be that if you were a Christian, people knew it because you wore a cross. But now anybody wears a cross. Madonna wears a cross. And so we brought back the image of the fish, but we shouldn't have had to do that. So it is really, to me, what a liberal arts should be. And the other thing I'll throw in is that when a person today says they listen to classical music, they don't generally mean they only listen to Mozart. They listen to Baroque and classical and Romantic. So classical education certainly is grounded in the Greek and Roman classics, but it really connotes all the great books right up until today. So it is a little bit of a catch-all word, but I wouldn't abandon it. I think it's the best word now. Liberal arts doesn't do it anymore.
So,
Hey,
you
can
know,
I ask Chris, what do you think? Did I miss something there? Chris, do you think, Schlect?
Well, yeah, I think, first of all, this is simply an exercise in lexical history, you know. So I mean, we could go back to the Latin from which our English classical is derived. If something was classical, it in the Roman world referred to that which conforms to what the elite definers of taste and urbane tastes have approved of. So it's that which is approved by the approved caste, so to speak. So that's just what the adjective meant in Latin. Then we start seeing it applied to music, to this concert music in the 18th century, where the adjective classical, when applied to music, starts to occupy a wider valence and range of meaning when it's applied to music. And then, but I don't know, I'm interested in the references to Dante that you made. I've just pulled up in my notes here. Since we're on the screen, I can do this. Here's a job ad from 1926 that I just pulled up from an education journal. It said, classical mistress for important school on the South Coast to teach Latin and Greek, together with subsidiary scripture with English and elementary mathematics, honors graduate essential. A classical mistress is teaching Latin and Greek. And I think you're going to see that usage of the adjective more or less
primarily.
Yeah, primarily.
Yeah.
So let's diverge from here, and Carol, I'll get to you in just a sec. I appreciate your comment, Chris, that there's a lexical history and there's an etymology, and so that's one place to go to try to understand what it is and what we're trying to do. But there's also this, you know, language is fluid and it changes as we use it, as Louis is pointing out, even with symbols like the cross. So what it means now also has a range of meaning that it didn't have, you know, in 200 AD. And the way we've been using it, if the meaning of words can be their use, we have been using classical to describe what we're doing now for about 40 years. So it's taking on some new contemporary meanings, but as everyone's hearing, there is a range and a history of meaning too that can create confusion. And so I think that's one reason why there's a lot of people on the call right now. Is they're like, well, what is it? And so I'd like us to pivot and start addressing. Think about some of the folks who might be on the call right now saying, I'd like a clear description of what it is you guys are actually up to. What is it that we're trying to do? I think Martin and Brian were right. We're stuck with the phrase. Even if we want to change the phrase and use alternative phrasings, which we could call it liberal arts education, liberal education, education in the Greek, Roman, and ecclesial tradition. There, you know, we look for phrases to try to expand the meaning at various times. But let's try to help people coming in new. What is it that you're doing? Carol, how would you like to address that question?
One of the things I think that we could add that would be helpful, and that we've all sort of mentioned, and that Louis sort of focused on in his comments, was that this is also a great books education. Now that's introducing another controversial term, and there's obviously some range of opinion about what a great book is, although I think a lot of us know it when we see it and reread it. But I think that a classical, again, the word classical was not foreign to me, but the way that my education proceeded, I understood it as a liberal education, an education as I described it. You know, the first seminal book for me was my desert island book is The Republic. It's the book that swept me off my feet and to turn me away from law school, at least for a while. And so I think that we're also talking about a liberal arts education, about a great books education, a text-based education that involves discussion, reading, studying, discussing the great texts, the great authors that are in conversation with themselves, with each other over the centuries, disagreeing with themselves, with each other, and with us. And so I think that we're largely talking about an education that proceeds through the study of these texts, these great books that we all discuss.
You're muted.
I'd like to give everyone a chance to offer a definition. And so we'll do this, maybe we have plenty of time tonight, so we'll do this maybe for about 10 minutes. And so some of you wrote some nice definitions. Brian, I'm thinking of yours, was 6 different elements. Of course, I love what Martin did, with a metaphor. And several of you use metaphors too, because some of you said, to describe this prosaically is difficult. It's a complex thing. So metaphors are really helpful and you use them. So if you want to just get out your essay, and if you'd be willing to just read a section where you offered a kind of definition, some of them were really helpful. So who would like to go first?
Hey, Chris, who was the one that wrote the essay where you went over the ACCS and the SCL and the liberal arts tradition book? Who was that?
That was Chris Schlect.
Because I think that's a good one. The one that you arrived at, to me, is a good place to start. At the very end of your essay, you combined everything. And to me, that's a good place to start if you want to.
Yeah, let's hear Chris's and then Brian, I would love for you to tee up yours.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I think that, so I would pull it together this way, that it is an education that has a peculiar source and a peculiar means to achieve a peculiar end. And the source is to draw upon educational authorities of the past. That's our source. And what we're doing with those sources is we're cultivating, liberating intellectual habits. And we're doing this to the end that we impart Christian virtue and piety, virtue, informing virtue in our students.
Thank you. I think it's helpful to start thinking of categories because they're common. And I think this is where we encounter some themes where I think we all likely agree. There's a traditional source. Chris is making that point. That this education is appealing to something authoritative from the past. And it's moving towards a particular end. And he said virtue, wisdom. That's
Right.
a very common theme in the renewal classical ed. Brian, let's hear yours.
Yeah, and I agree with Chris on this. I think we have to start with the ends, because I've often said the ends don't justify the means, but they should determine them. So once you have the ends, then you can ask, well, what materials get us to those ends? What methods get us to those ends? What kind of culture gets us to those ends? And so this is the definition I work with. Classical education uses the accumulated works and wisdom of the ages to foster the integrated multidimensional formation of human persons in 7 areas: intellectually, morally, aesthetically, spiritually, physically, practically, and socially, by nurturing them respectively on the true, good, beautiful, holy, healthy, beneficial, and neighborly for the sake of their own flourishing and that of their communities. I think if you read the history of the tradition that we're a part of, you see all 7 of those elements, not in any one author, but you see those 7 elements traced throughout the tradition, because those are the 7 elements that constitute human well-being and human flourishing. And I think that's what we're doing in classical education, is working with the nature of the human person as it's been given to us, and trying to find ways to foster that for the sake, again, of the individual's flourishing, but also the flourishing of their community. So that's, I can go through those 7 again, but a lot of people have heard me go through those.
Well,
a number of you have learned to say these things almost like commonplaces. So Brian will often talk about, the intellectual, the aesthetic, the spiritual, the social, and the various ways those things all kind of line up as ends that we seek. So, and like in anything that's kind of interesting and complex, there can be a number of good ways of offering a definition. But let me open it up to some of the others. All of you said something about this that was interesting. Christine used a metaphor of the tree and a horse being beaten to death. Chris used an illustration of a distilled mash making liquor. Yes, he did. Martin used coffee. Christine, we'll go to you, and then let's hear from Chris and Martin, because they both used beverages to describe what classical ed could be.
Well, I'll just read a definition, then I'll give my metaphor. Here's the good of classical education. It offers the remembered treasures of our humanity, astonishing riches piled high like Tutankhamun's burial site or Smaug's cave, or the Anglo-Saxon treasures unearthed at Sutton Hoo, offered through the intelligence and love of a human being riveted by this beauty to another human being who is learning how to receive and increasingly belong to a place and a people. And then one of the metaphors that I was working with is, we're like great trees, like one in my backyard, uprooted and fallen with no way for our roots to be nourished and watered. Putting the trees back in the good soil is a tremendous task.
Thank you, Christine. I appreciate your reference to a people, a nation, shared community, and a number of you touched on that as well. And of course, I love the metaphorical ways you describe things. The Smaug's treasure, Sutton Hoo, remembered treasures. So that's just for our listeners. Isn't it interesting? Metaphors can work here, can be very helpful. And Chris, what was your lead metaphor, Chris?
Mine was distillation. And again, I tend to think in terms of common art. So as I was going back across this, I was thinking, what is the thing that's closest to that I can offer this? 1,000 words to describe classical education, I found a tremendous challenge. So I kind of had to invoke a little poetry here. I think by definition, it kind of provides the bandwidth. So I had said, I invoke distillation, which involves a mash coming to maturity. The mash of our moment takes in the grain bill provided by, and then a series of names, several of whom are on this call. Others are historical. And that grain was grown, the grain that goes into that mash, in soil dating back to antiquity, turned and amended through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, sprinkled with a compost of matured Enlightenment thought, but not too much, only that which aligns. Modernity makes the attempt to be turned in always, but the culture of the soil being healthy wards off much of what might otherwise find its way in unbidden. Add to all this the rye, or perhaps rye, W-R-Y, of a few decades of modern medievals pitching amendments to the barrel, and we have what we pour over the rocks of our moment. And the whole notion here is to kind of get thinking about a mash to maturity. We have grain that's sprouted, that's now put into a solution and given yeast. It's been leavened, essentially like bread, and it ferments. And we see, I think on this call alone, the number of people who have fermented the mash of their own studies. We have medievalists, we have classicists, we have theologians, we have philosophers, we have business folks, we have mathematicians, we have, you name it, right? We're here. And I think the combined mash of this produces something that is ultimately good, true, and beautiful. And I think, Carrie, I noticed that you and I were the only two to reference Philippians 4:8 here. And I kind of found that of all the verses we could have picked, we both picked that one. And let me just put that one out amongst the group now too, because we could think of, alcohol as an intoxicant, but lest we forget, Jesus's first miracle was turning water to wine at the behest of his mother. And I'm aiming into that, right? Leaning a little bit into that version of this. It says, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put it into practice. And this ultimately, to me, leans into not only the goodness, truth, and beauty of what we pursue as classical educators, but the fact that we ourselves are the curriculum. And I think that's something a few folks around here mentioned. It calls us to something that is deep. We must be committed to this and our own personal development along these lines. But at the same time, we're seeking to lay that path out for our students. We can put the books in front of them, but unless we talk into them, unless we speak into them, unless we live, breathe, and emit the aroma of those books within our classrooms, then we'll lose something in that experience. And that's a powerful thing to think through.
I just want to dovetail, jump on Chris, just to emphasize that passage where he says, think about these things and put them into practice. I mean, that's what's so crucial there for me. And so I think as classical educators, we need to think about classical living, not just the classical content and classical pedagogy, but living the classical tradition in the cultures of our schools, homes, and churches, because it's in those cultures that are formed in that classical living within which students are going to be formed. So yeah, just piling up on that. I think that's so great. It's such a great passage.
Yeah, thank you, Chris and Brian. We're number of places to go. We'll go to Martin next, and then we're going to go to Junius and Carol and Jolie and Davies. We want to hear from them. So you guys would be, just get ready to respond. But Chris opened up a couple of things. With his metaphor, he seems to be saying, among other things, that a lot of good things can get pulled in over time to make something good. And that means things change as well. A fermenting process means that things aren't static. They can grow. There's a culture that seems to be alive. And so classical education, I think, from this perspective, is alive. It's changing, not willy-nilly. It's changing according to some ordered process with good ingredients. And this relates to something that I saw in Junius's article as well as in Carrie's. Junius talked about how and Carol's. Carol loves Socrates, and she points out that the Socratic tradition has been pulled in and is extended forward and extended through. There's a sense in which we take what is good in Socrates and we blend them into Chris's mash. And so we talk about Socratic seminars and Socratic teaching, and we read Socrates today. And then Junius talks about the Greek and Roman tradition being theistic, even if not Christian, and that there's a transcendental component to Greek and Roman non-Christian education that gets transformed from polytheism to Christian theism. But nonetheless, there's a kind of progression there, you might say. So Martin, with all that before you, how would you untangle that or weave it together? And if you could do it with a cup of coffee, we'd love to hear it.
Well, now that I've heard this discussion, I don't agree with my article. Because what I was basically saying was that to say classical education, to use that adjective, is something that we say now, which used to not be needed because all education was classical. And yet at the same time, I do think the classical label is valuable. I mean, number one, I don't think that we should abandon it now that it's successful. This is the most successful thing in education. We would be making the new Coke mistake if we changed it. And so, so that what is meant by classical education is exactly what it says. Okay, classical means the cultures of Greece and Rome. What it means, the classical cultures. Classical education has always been the transmission of the culture, primarily of Greece, secondarily of Rome, taken over by the church. And so you have this culture of Athens and Jerusalem. And there's a whole history of how that gets all worked out, but it does get worked out. And classical education, you can add classical on there if you want to make explicit what's implicit in it, is the culture of Athens and Rome transmitted over generations. That's what classical education is. And I think that term classical, yes, it starts getting used a lot in the 20th century because it's having to compete with competitors. The earliest use of it in modern times that I know of is in Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, where there's this dinner conversation at Karenin's house. And there's this big debate over classical versus modern education. And it's very clear in there that what they're referring to is vocationalism, because there's been two revolutions from the late 19th century to the early 20th century that affected what people thought education was. The first was the Industrial Revolution. So we have people start asking this question, well, what is that useful to be taking this kind of education and teaching it to our children if they're going to go into jobs? And the second is the psychological revolution in the late 19th century. And that's what produces progressivism. So the term gets to be used more and more, I think, around the turn of the century. And, our Memoria College books just put out R.W. Livingston's A Defense of Classical Education, which I think is the best defense of classical education that has been written. And he makes a very big deal about the cultures of Greece and Rome. And I think that classical label, I think, is making that very explicit, what we're talking about here. Education, classical education, is the transmission of the culture of Athens and Rome through the study of the arts and the sciences.
Thank you, Martin. Now, when you say that, you still make a pretty big container, because we've inherited some pedagogies, not all of which we would use at every time. We've inherited some curricular sequence, where the curriculum that we've inherited also morphs and changes. And there's this, and now that we're in the 21st century, there's another revolution that perhaps we're in the midst of. And so we have to adapt, don't we? So
but I would say though that you're making a distinction, implicit distinction between material causation and final causation. I think you got to get your final causation, your purpose down first, and then the other things fall into place.
Yeah. Fair enough. We're back to maybe, source and ends again. And then we keep in mind Brian's distinctions of these various dimensions, multiple dimensions of human dimensions, the societal, the spiritual, the aesthetic, the intellectual. All these have something to do with a formation of a human being. And these have been talked about a lot, of course, as well. So Carol, we'll go to you, and then Davies and Junius and Jolie, we need to hear from you guys. So
and Carrie.
Yeah, so Carrie, in your essay, you say,
wait, Chris, you said Carol will go to you, and then you start.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, Carrie. I was looking at her, said the wrong thing. Sorry about that. So Carrie, in your essay, you say that you often talk to people who ask what is classical education, and they have a particular concern in mind, like getting into a good college, like being prepared for the real world, or being morally formed. And so often people ask the question, maybe with one of those dimensions, as Brian talks about in his definition. And your response is to say, yes, but, yes, but, yes, but. So tell us why you wrote your essay that way.
Well, most of my audience are people who are in my area in Siloam Springs, Arkansas, and we have people who are not familiar with classical education at all, and they are interested in our school, in the school that I co-founded here, and they are interested because mainly it's not a public school. So I'm having to communicate to people who don't understand liberal arts. In fact, if you say the word liberal, you may be suggesting something completely different. If you even say the word classical, that could be taken as a very elitist form of education. We have at our school, our constituents, we have a lot of farmers, we have people who work in factories, we have college professors also, we have all sorts of people. And so when I talk about classical education, I actually try not to use the word classical, and I try not to use the word liberal arts, actually. And so when I was writing the essay, I was thinking, how would I explain this to these constituents? And I explain it as something that's much more. It goes deeper. And that seems to resonate with parents, teachers, and community members. When I've talked to them and they say, well, we thought classical education was some elitist, atheistic, liberal education, you know, and I had to set some parents and community members straight about that and explain classical education without using that word. And I basically said, I like what Ryan said about, you know, we have to think about all ages, you know, in stages of their life. So I look and tell them it's the kind of education that they would have, you know, to help their children be raised in virtue, to love the best of the truest and the best and most true and most beautiful things that we have, just like in the scripture in Philippians. And, you know, whatever is true, whatever is good, whatever is noble, and have those things in all ages and stages of their life. So as grown-ups, as parents, not all of these students are going to go to college and, you know, have a humanities education. They're going to be church members and parents and factory workers and farmers. And, you know, these parents can understand something like they understand that we want a deep education. We want our children to love the best things that this life has to offer. We want them to be able to flourish in all parts of their lives. And I say, that's what, do you want that? And they say, yes, that's what I want. And I say, well, then you want a classical education. So, so that's kind of where I go, that it's for the whole person, and to have the skills and the ideas that are going to help them flourish in the rest of their life as a whole person.
Thank you, Carrie. I like the way you proceed inductively. You have a conversation with them, and by the time you're done, you say, well, that's what classical education is. Now you understand. Davies or Junius, pick it up from here and just respond to what you've heard, and please offer your own insights into defining classical ed.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate, Carrie, your thinking about kind of the audience. I've spent the last 20 plus years effectively trying to figure out, how do you answer the question, what is classical Christian education? That was the impetus behind, I think, Chris, you may remember 20 years ago, I called you, I think, and I asked you that question, and you said something about human soul formation. And I thought it was about reading, writing, and arithmetic with better books. And so I was having to work this through as an early head of school, and then I ended up doing a Q conference, or Q talk, which is kind of like a TED talk at 18 minutes on a national stage. Some of you may remember that, where I'm stacking boxes, trying to compare and contrast contemporary progressive education and classical education. So, some of you may remember, probably 6 years ago, I went to an ACCS conference with a camera crew, and I did a man on the street kind of, or an educator at the conference, saying, what is classical Christian? I must say it's one of the more awkward videos, just with so many of us who should know the answer to that, with kind of this gobbledygook explanations of, you know, stacking Legos and all these beverage drinking or whatever we were doing. And I think most of these answers are great within the academy. The challenge I'm always trying to figure out is, how do you answer this winsomely in the proverbial elevator pitch without 300-story building to answer it in? Like, how do you answer it quickly and to the point? And to some things, Carrie, you're saying about, you know, at kind of a street level, and a street level made up of millennials and Gen Z. So that's so much of what I'm doing right now professionally is really trying to lean in and consult schools and figure out parent education and parent partnership. And so I answered this definition with that, again, kind of a street level, short parking lot conversation. So I will say, when asked, is that classical Christian education is forming what our children love through their joyful discovery of what is true, good, and beautiful, leading to a flourishing life. And so let me kind of unpack that a little bit. It's more student-centered than historically centered. So the question, or I would say then again, so it's forming, and you're gonna laugh at me now, but I actually have hand gestures I teach parents, because I'm like, we got to break this thing down to, like, again, sidewalk, quick answer. After, I usually will say something like, well, it's the way everyone in the West was educated up until 100 years ago, which causes them to go, wait, what are we talking about? Really? Yes. And then I will say it's forming versus informing. So again, we want, clearly we're in the formation business, forming what our children love, heart shape here. So this is, you know, the James K. Smith is desire, you know, it's the desires, the formation of loves. It's Jonathan Edwards' affections, It's forming what our children love through what? Through their joyful discovery. So the focal point is not stage on the stage, stage on the stage. It's really what's that formation happening in the life of the students as their loves are being formed, forming what they love through what? Through their joyful discovery of what? Of what is true, good, and beautiful to the end of a flourishing life. So I find parents understand, they don't understand all the nuances in that. There's not liberal, I'm not talking about liberal arts, but I'm talking about something very vastly different than what's typically happening in the schools around them, which is more of the sit and get school with different ideologies all around it. So again, very simple, but I feel like I'm trying to crack the code on that street level answer.
Mhm.
Thank you, Davies. That's so helpful. And I think it's for everyone listening, you're just seeing like I'm thinking of the museum or the cathedral. There's a lot of doorways in, and depending on your audience, you might want to come in this door or that door. There's a number of things that might attract you to it. The same thing would be true, say, I think of the Christian church. A number of people come into the church with different presenting interests, concerns, cares. And I just like the fact that Davies has highlighted one of the, like, is one of the dimensions that Brian talked about. You know, what does it mean? Just take the aesthetic, for example. If classical education actually educates our ability to see and appreciate beauty, that can be a doorway in for a particular person. Another person might be very interested in a just society, and that could be a way of coming in. So it has these different doorways in, but to talk about one door doesn't mean that the others aren't present.
And that's where Carrie's bit is so great, where it's like, it is that, but there's more. And let me tell you about that more. And yeah, you care about that. Yeah, we care about that too. And there's more, because the human person is more. So I love that approach, that response. Yes, but there's more.
And if Jake were here, he would be saying, be careful that you don't go generic and make classical education so generic that anything can be it. Or to be so purist that you say, you know, if you're not doing Hebrew, it's not a classical school. Carol?
I was also going to mention that one of the things that I appreciated in Carrie's piece was what she said about it not necessarily being safe. That is that classical liberal arts education, and this is something like what it resonates with some of the things that I wrote, is not safe. It's about intellectual risk taking. It's about the willingness to examine one's own opinions that one sort of holds close and dear, and subject them to examination and thinking really hard about them, so that it's not safe per se. It's taking an intellectual risk. It's engaging with ideas that might be different or foreign to you, but for the sake of asking the tough questions and finding out what the truth is about things in the end. So I really like the way you said that, because we spend so much time in, at least in higher education and probably in other areas of education, public education, worrying about whether children are safe, but we don't worry about whether they think clearly and fully and deeply about things, and the important questions that make them, the answers to which make them fully educated human beings. And I think that was a really important point in Carrie's essay.
This might be something to pick up as we go to the next hour, because this is controversial too. You know, what does it mean to expose our children to ideas with which we don't agree and with which they might not agree? How do you do that if you're in a Christian classical school and you're reading somebody, you know, like Plato or Aristotle, who many of the things they say Christians will agree with right away, as we know from reading the ancient Christians like Augustine, but there are some things with which Christians will disagree. How do we do this? So let's put a pin in that question. But what I want to do now is let Junius respond and Jolie, and then and Jolie's saying no, maybe not, maybe. But then we've got 8 questions teed up. So after we've heard from Junius, anyway, we're going to open up those questions, and then we're going to let it kind of go more free form. I'm going to try not to control it too much. So you see a question there that you like, I'll probably read it. just jump in and let's see where it goes. But I'd like to put a pin on that question that Carol asked, because classical education, sometimes kids go through a classical school and they don't come out just the way you were thought or hoped they would in every instance. Junius, what are you thinking?
Well, I'm thinking about tradition, and the ways that, tradition is not the preserving of a sacred fire in the center of the village so that it doesn't go out. And so what you're doing is you're trying to ward off everything to protect this fire. Tradition is there's an active, there are two active parts of tradition. There's the act of handing it on, without which the tradition would die. And there's also the act of receiving it. And if you don't think that there's a special skill in receiving what's handed to you, go back and look at the U.S. Olympic relay teams over the past 4 or 5 Olympics, where every Olympics over and over again, they get disqualified because they dropped the baton. It's like, come on, guys, like that's how the races run, right? And one of the things that's very interesting about looking at the great tradition, at this conversation, that the sinew that connects us back to Greece and Rome, because we can't jump over anybody between us and Greece and Rome to get back to Greece and Rome, even if we think we are, or if in our ignorance it feels like we are. Nevertheless, how we're understanding Greece and Rome is controlled by that. Even the very fact that it can seem to us that Greece looms larger than Rome shows who has been transmitting, who we've been listening to in this transmission stream, because there's a way to problematize that. And I'm thinking about the Celts in Britain, who tell the story that they are the descendants of the Trojans. That they sort of, and there's actually a really good linguistic basis for this. This is not just like a crazy story. The Romans have the same story, of course. That's what the Aeneid's all about. The Norsemen have the same story. The Asgardian gods came from Troy up into the northern. I was like, what's going on there? Troy lost, guys. Aren't you aware? Like, didn't you read the book? Don't you want to be the victors, the Hellenists? Well, there's a lot going on there. But the thing I would focus our attention on is just that there's a creative appropriation of the past that is an important task of what it is we're trying to grow students into, right? And so I'll jump ahead. One of the questions was, if someone received a classical education through high school, is there a reason they should go to a classical college for university? And in one sense, you might say, well, I mean, no, if they've been set up properly, institutio, then they can go wherever. But on the other hand, don't make the mistake of thinking that classical education is something one has done, right? None of us on the screen have done classical education. We're all engaged in the project of Western civilization, which is progressing in a classical manner and creatively appropriating the tradition and trying to faithfully hand on what we've appropriated to those who come after us, right? So in my essay, I focused our attention on, I wanted to get really clear because I do think there's some equivocation that happens, that classical education refers to several different things, and I wanted to separate those out so we could know what we're talking about. But I also wanted to get at, I'm keenly aware that the way that we do classical education now is not the way the medievals did it. And the way the medievals did it was not the way that it was being done in the rhetoric schools in Augustine's time. And that's not the way that it was being done in Plato's time, right? I mean, there's no single way this thing has been done throughout here. But I do believe there's a unity here. And I do believe we are part of that same tradition of education that goes all the way back to Plato and his rival Aristotle, his rival student, right? And so what is it that binds all that together? And I think it's a certain vision of what the human person is. I think that's what's at the heart of all of this, right? And so early in my essay, I said classical education is for humans. This seems trivial, but it's not, because it implies that we have some understanding of what humans are. And so it includes claims about what humans are. And so it is, classical education considers humans to be rational creatures. And after spending some time talking about the different aspects of that, I end this way, and I think this is germane to what we've been talking about. So both as it aims at the ordering of the human soul and as it aims at the regulating of human ways of thinking, classical education is mimetic, because it recognizes that humans belong to their world and that the world is ordered under transcendent reality. It seeks to properly modulate the human in relation to these external realities. And I finished by pointing out that there are two habits of the soul, if you will, dispositiones better, what you would call virtues, passive virtues, that I think are the outcome and the goal of good classical education. And those are wonder, by which we marvel at the great disparities that define our cosmos, and worship, by which we open our hearts to the presence and molding of the Creator, affirming his authority and basking in his grace. I think that is like a common thread that runs through this project that's been going on for the last 3,500 years. And there's a lot that we can, it gives us a lot of freedom because we don't have to do it any particular way, but it also focuses us on that telos that so many of us are gesturing towards, right? Why are we doing this?
Junius, I would just add a W to your alliterative pair there of wisdom, because it seems like wonder, worship, and wisdom would go together, because wonder, yes, worship, but then the proper kind of response, what that should form in me is wisdom for how
that's
to,
nice. That's nice.
how to love and how to act. So
love it.
Well, this is very helpful. I think we are seeing some common themes. What is the human? Some of you listening know who have joined us. I think everybody on this panel knows that humanitas is another word for education in the Latin language, just meant to be fully formed as a human. So that's something that's been picked up and transferred. But, and I'd like to put one more pin in another question. It's something that Chris Schlect raised when he said there can be several classical educations, plural, but he's concerned about going abstract with a kind of classical education that's so undefined that we don't even know what we're talking about when we use the word classical. So we could say it's the things that bind, it's human, it's flourishing, it's connected to the past, it's traditional, it's authoritative, but there can be different incarnations of it. And I think maybe it's helpful for us to talk about what the incarnations could be, should be, and are, because those are distinctions that are happening right now. There are various different kinds of incarnations of it, and hopefully it's like friendship bread. It's got the same culture in it, but not always the same ingredients after the basic yeast and flour. But let's hit the pause button. We still have 50 minutes, so I hope we'll have some great conversation. And one also just a prompt before I forget. Next quarter, we're going to be discussing the question, what is a great book? Carol already was alluding to this. It can be difficult to say this book deserves to be read. This one we would include in a curriculum of the great books, and this one maybe not. How and why would we make those such decisions? So that's next quarter, and I'm sure everybody in this call has some thoughts about that. So I'm looking forward to some additional essays. But let's take a look at the questions. And so I'm going to open up our question box here. And the first one is Christine. And she says, what is confusing to me as a homeschooling parent is the difference between classical Christian education and classical education. They seem to be used almost interchangeably, but they would not seem to be the same thing, or even the same, but they would not seem to be the same thing, or even the same thing in one Christian setting versus another Christian setting. Can you elaborate on this, which is getting to some points that were made by Chris and others? Well, what do we mean when we say classical education? Who would like to take this one on first? Carol.
This is something I was thinking about and listening to the conversation. I don't come from a Christian background. That's the first thing, and maybe I'm different in that way from most people on the call. But I also, the Great Hearts Institute for Classical Education is embedded in a classical, the Great Hearts Classical Charter school system, which is non-denominational, not without a religious affiliation, and yet we still aim at providing a classical education, a classical liberal arts education that is text-based and that proceeds through the raising of questions and aims at whatever the mantra that everyone has, that many have repeated this evening: the good, the true, and the beautiful, through the study of and sort of wrestling with text through the Socratic method. in every area of pedagogy and every level of the school curriculum. So in that way, it is officially not associated with Christian education. So I thought I would just put that out there as one of the answers to this question. So I would argue that that's possible.
Yeah, well, and then on the other side of that question, there are sometimes Christians who will say, "Oh, classical is Christian." So it just gets confusing, right? Well, what do you mean, and what sense is it Christian or not? This word classical is fluid enough that you see it used in these ways. So, Martin, you often talk about this too. Do you want to comment on it, or somebody else?
Yeah, I think practically speaking, there really is no differentiation. When you say classical education, historically speaking, in terms of what we have now and how we got it, it's classical Christian education, because Rome becomes a Christian empire by the end of its history. You have Augustine, who's living at the very tail end of the empire. His city of Hippo is besieged by the barbarians, and his body is being buried in the inner city. He's right at the end of that period, and he's talking about this. In the city of God, he talks about this, and this whole debate that's going on there about, well, should we as Christians be taking advantage of the pagan learning? And he's arguing in the West, absolutely, it's the Egyptian gold. It doesn't matter where it came from. All that matters is whether it's true and good. And the Cappadocian fathers in Constantinople are basically using the same arguments. And so that all that classical learning gets dumped into the lap of the church, and it's preserved in monasteries and this sort of thing, and is revived starting in the 8th century with the Carolingian revival, and it's brought back into the Christian West. So this stuff has been preserved and transmitted by the church and changed in certain ways, I think, too, in accordance with Christian theology. But what we have now is the result of that historical process, which, with the acknowledgement that the church played the major role in.
Well, that just seems to me that's lexical and historical again, but in terms of current use, can.
Well, I know we use that interchangeably. I mean, we always have.
Well,
but I think when you say classical Christian education, I think just that is some comfort to the Christians out there who do have questions about studying the pagans. And you have to explain that. I just had to do that today. But practically speaking, they are referring to the same object.
Well, let's hear someone on the other side of that. Junius.
Yeah, I would argue that they're not the same, not even practically today. And I would argue the reason why is because what Christian adds to classical education is a specific view of the human person that's the target of the education that is not the same as what a non-Christian thinks the human person is. And insofar as the classical education is teleologically grounded, and it's more teleologically grounded than the progressive education, which is pragmatically grounded, right? It seems to aim at a telos because it aims at getting a job or something like that, but really it doesn't matter. It's not modulating the means to the ends in ways that are profound. It's really whatever services that goal of getting to that is fine. Whereas classical education, I think, is very much concerned at what type of person do we want to make at the end of the day. And insofar as Christian virtue, this gets to another question in the question queue there. I do think Christian virtue and non-Christian virtue are different. I think it's quite a big difference whether your ideal person is Socrates or Jesus. And insofar as that is different, you're going to see a difference all the way down the line in what you think, where you think these human persons need to go and what the right means are to get them there.
Well, I agree with that, but I do think the whole idea of creating an ideal person is shared by both, and that's going to take some different manifestations, obviously, because of Christian theology versus what some pagans may think. But I think we, even as Christians, we can look back and we can study Plato, we can study Aristotle, and we can see that they're seeing things because they were created in the image of God. It would absolutely agree, right?
Okay, Brian, and then Christine.
Well, and Carrie had her hand up too. I just want to, point out that we have great hearts, not identified with religious tradition. We have Jewish classical schools, we have Islamic classical schools that are starting, and we have Christian classical schools. And so what do all those have in common? I mean, to call themselves classical, I mean, I do think Chris and I just had this conversation a little bit in Virginia, I don't know, last month. I mean, I think we just want to acknowledge there are schools. It's not just Christian classical education versus progressive education. There are, non-religious and Islamic and Jewish who would all have a lot in common with an understanding of what constitutes a flourishing human. I mean, there's a reason that we all learn from the Nicomachean Ethics, obviously Aristotle, pagan Greek, but he was able to discern certain aspects of how life goes well empirically and help us understand how we cultivate the virtues. So I think I'm, with Martin on this, as a Christian theologian, I would appeal to some version of natural law and being made in the image of God, that we should expect people, Christian or not, to be able to discern certain ways that life goes well, certain questions, certain ends, and certain texts. And so I'm just putting that out there, just be careful that we're not thinking only of classical Christian education versus progressive education, but recognizing these other religious traditions that also see themselves in the classical tradition somehow. Carrie, you wanted to jump in here earlier.
I just wanted to echo really just what you were saying, that, what I see as the common thread of all classical education, varieties, is that you have just a transcendent quality, a universal quality of certain universal virtues that are kind of common. I think you said natural law of us knowing that there are certain ways that how the world works. And so I think that that's what classical education has in common in all varieties and all different religions. As a classical Christian educator, just what Junius was saying, it's very logocentric. So everything gets its purpose and centers around who Christ is and my relationship with him. But and that helps me see, the world, the cosmos in a particular way. But I think we can gather together, what all of that has in common. I know Irving Babbitt, I've been reading about the humanists of the early 20th century, and he was not he was not suggesting a certain religion, but he was trying to bring together, what do all the major religions, have in common that helps people live the best way, to live the good life. And he talks about a classical education, not necessarily a Christian education, but a classical education that's based on the great books and universal ideas that have stood the test of time.
Okay, it's going to be a Christine, Chris, and the Davies.
So I think it's pretty.
Can I just let me just read a couple of questions that are similar that the three of you might want to address at the same time. Rodrigo says, is it necessary to specify Christian virtue, or can we just say impart virtue and piety? And then this person writes, how do you see the works of the Eastern classics? Are they part of classical education that you want to give? Christine?
Yeah, so I think it's pretty important that we think in terms of minimums and maximums. In fact, I would say that, there are plenty of people who would think that even saying Christian classical education is itself a bit abstract. There would be people who would be saying like, no, we should define Christian even more specifically. And, we have schools that are doing this, where they're doing classical Christian education out of their parish. That's very specific. So, I mean, I don't think we want one here. I think it's a very good thing that we have minimums that we all share, and we have maximums where we diverge. And I think that, we have plenty of room for that spectrum of engagement. I also think that there's a reason that we have the cardinal virtues and the theological virtues. That's another minimum maximum discussion. Obviously, there are places where the theological virtues might be there might be a breakdown between the cardinal and the theological, but for the most part, there's a bridge between them, and we can, historically, all of us can agree on the goods of the cardinal. So I think that's the kind of conversation that we're having here. And I don't think it's very useful to say, no, there's one way to do this. There's one definition. There's one outcome. We don't live, we're not Sweden. We're not Norway. We don't have one small group of people looking to be one thing. And I think it's very useful for each group to define where it is on the spectrum and why. But
thank you, Christy. Now, when you say pointing out maximums in different ways, Christians are addressing this. Just to highlight, there are some ecclesial schools, there's Catholic schools, Anglican schools, Presbyterian schools, all wanting their schools to reflect their particular church tradition, and that can be meaningful. And as Brian's pointed out, there's the advent of some Islamic and Jewish schools that are also calling themselves classical. Davies, and then Chris.
Yeah, I mean, we talked earlier just about the fluidity of words. I mean, the word, again, classical, to your classical comment. I mean, and you also see the rise of a lot of kind of more mainstream ACSI schools now looking for a marketing differentiator and saying, well, let's bring in classical. You hear that kind of phraseology. It also just was going to note, a lot of educators in classical Christian space keep flip-flopping which one's first, is it Christian classical or classical Christian? You hear that going back and forth. And I think, but what's behind that is the sense that we need to somehow put a, sort of, I guess, sacramentally set classical second to Christian, which, put God first in that equation, which is then to imply that the classical itself doesn't have enough Christian DNA in it to stand on its own. So again, you can kind of see the working out even the way different people prioritize what's the adjective and what's the noun, I guess not. So
thank you, Davies. Chris.
Yeah, and I think I would build on that, recognizing that the word classical is an adjective and it functions like an adjective. And let's just reflect on that. So the adjective fast, for example, functions like an adjective as well. So you can have a fast car, you can have a fast glacier, you can have a fast fish. And so then do we step back and think about, okay, so let's have the community of fast things. That just seems weird because the adjective fast, while it retains integrity as an adjective, it points to vastly different things. And when we're talking about education, I think the adjective classical retains integrity as an adjective, even if it points to vastly different things. I mean, Martin talked about Plato and Aristotle. I would agree with Martin that Martin described Plato and Aristotle being read from a Christian perspective, through a Christian perspective, from the standpoint of Christianity. But we recognize that there will be Muslims who will read Plato and Aristotle through Muslim lenses, and they have a different vision of humanity. They have a different vision of what the transcendentals are, or virtues. And if piety is among our virtues, which I think is something to chase after, can we call it piety? Is it really piety if we don't privilege the God we identify in piety? It becomes kind of a bastardization of the very notion of piety to have generic piety, to have unattached piety. And similarly, then, I would say if we're talking about classical education, it's got to attach itself to something in order to retain its integrity. Rather, there is no, and I said this in my essay, there's no classical generic education. I do think that there's classical Islamic education. I think there's classical Christian education. And I think there can be some classical other educations, but to suggest classical education is kind of like saying the community of fast things, and just because of their fastness.
Chris, in your article, you even said classical American or national education. Like, so in other words, and so I think that could apply to the charter schools, could it not? You know, the charter schools are looking to some kind of tradition, historical tradition that might be, you know, American, civic, etc. And then, of course, what's interesting about some of these charter schools is that they're very friendly to faith traditions. And so they will allow, like I was at a charter school recently, and you know, there's an Orthodox priest who teaches there and was wandering down the hallways going into one of his classes. Like that's fine. But given the way American public education has gone so secular, there's almost a bifurcation where people at first think that anything that's not Christian has got to be really secular. But these charter schools are doing something that just doesn't fit those categories. That's been my experience. They're of course they're not promulgating a religious point of view, but but nor are they trashing religion.
Right.
You know, they're not. You know, they're reading the Bible. They're reading. You know, anyway, it's another ambiguous in between area for us right now to try to define what it is.
Yeah, well, and Chris, I think that was helpful, and I think it furthers my point. I don't think that there's such a thing as disembedded classical education. By virtue of it being called classical, it must embed somewhere, and so you can embed it, and you can become a nationalist. You know, which is not my proclivity. You can become Marxist, and so you can read these texts through the lens of class struggle. You can be a Muslim. I think that the adjective classical retains its integrity in all of those various ways, and yet education no longer retains its integrity if we say it's all the same education. No, those are all very different educational programs, and they're not the same. They're as different as a glacier and a fish. They're both fast.
We'll go to Louis and then Junius.
Now, I'm not a pragmatist in the sense that Horace Mann or John Dewey's a pragmatist, but we do have to be practical about this. I wish all of our kids could go to a private classical Christian school, but just speaking practically, they're not going to be able to afford it or do it. And if we're going to slowly change around our public school system, we need Great House. We need Founders, which is up in Dallas. We have Aristoy here in Houston. And whenever I speak to those classical charter schools, you know what I do? I use The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis. I talk about the Tao. I talk about natural law. I talk about goodness, truth, and beauty. And one difference you can see between real classical schools, whatever their background is, and public schools is the difference between an education in virtue and an education in values. Virtues are an aspect of reality, okay? But values are shifting, changing, fashionable things. They move in and out, and our students are being constantly changed. A classical school generally wants some kind of fixed understanding, an absolute understanding of goodness, truth, and beauty that we can mold students against. And what I found for Great Hearts and for Founders is they obviously can't go out there and say, we want Christian teachers. But there is a way they can get mostly Christian teachers, and that's by having the teacher sign that they believe in goodness, truth, and beauty with capital letters. If they actually believe that, they may not be a Christian. They're probably a strong theist. There's often a number of Mormons that will be at classical schools. There may be a number of believing Muslims or Jews there. But as long as they... my president is Dr. Robert Sloan. And when Robert Sloan was initiated as president of Baylor, until he escaped and came to us, when he was at Baylor, the great Richard John Newhouse did a speech called 11 Theses for a Christian School. You can find that in First Things. And one of them he said was amazing. He said, in some ways, a Christian college or university, and I think a Christian school, is sometimes better served by a non-believer who actually believes in the mission of virtue, goodness, truth, and beauty than a so-called believer who doesn't believe in that mission. Now, I'm not saying I think we do need to have only believers teaching in a classical Christian school, but we need smuggled theology that we get in classical Christian schools so our students are at least being taught over against a standard that is not shifting with fashionable ideas.
This is complicated. You know, it's as these rivers and streams are all converging, but those of you who have visited various classical charter schools have probably, they vary too. And I'm sure, you know, Carol she represents Great Hearts, but I've just seen a variety of expression and incarnations. And I think that's just also something that's happening even in Christian classical education. There's a variety. Christine was making that point. So when you say classical Christian school, there should be some things that you can assume, but there would be some things that you need to find out. Because I think the variation is normal and has been for 2 millennia. There's always been variation, different lands, cultures, languages, etc. Variations of sequence and emphasis. But there is something that binds us together. What would you say that is? Just to kind of go to what binds these things together, that justifies kind of classical and classical Christian education. What are the things that that bind us together? Carol?
One of the things I would say, maybe the most fundamental thing, is the pursuit of a kind of objective truth, understanding of, and we keep using the good, the true, and the beautiful, but a pursuit of wisdom, a pursuit of understanding, and through a particular kind or way of education. I've sort of sounded repetitive this way, but the study of ideas, the study of books, the study of texts that guide that education. I think those are common themes, whatever kind of or approach to or end of classical education we've been discussing. I actually happen to be on the board of the Emmett School, which is maybe the first of the classical Jewish education schools opening, this one in Manhattan. And those are the ends of that school and of that education as they describe it themselves. So I think that's something common to a real classical liberal arts education. Just put that out there.
Thank you very much, Carol. Chris?
I would add some words that Ken Myers spoke a number of years ago. They recently came up with the Oxon Fellowship, and I think they're very powerful. The one that he put in an essay was, there's a givenness to reality, and it's good for us to conform ourselves to it, right? To paraphrase what he said. I think all of us as classical educators are seeking a certain givenness in reality, whether it's through the trivium, the quadrivium, the arts of language, the arts of math, the common arts, the fine arts, all of that. There's a underlying reality, and it's a good thing for us to not only know it's there, but to actively seek it out. And in the pursuit, we virtue, and we ourselves are formed. And I think that's a point to make here.
Sorry, I had my microphone muted. Let's go to Carrie and then Junius.
I'll just I like what you said, Chris. Just to reiterate that it's that pursuit. I think there's something about all of these things that kind of hinges on it's this wondering something more, which is why I put that much more. Like there's something else. And when I meet students in college who come to my house, they want to talk about real things. You use the word reality. They want to talk about the reality. They keep wanting to to go there. They want to have deep conversations, real conversations, and parents who want this education for their students. They want something more. There's something that they're trying to pursue that they're not getting. So I'll just reiterate that there's a pursuit of something more, higher, better.
Thank you, Carrie. Junius?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I want to affirm that there's distinction does not mean that there is not significant overlap. If it's possible that it matters whether education is classically, Christian classical versus secular humanist classical versus Jewish classical, that's grounded on the truth that all truth is God's truth. It is not a challenge to that. But I'm going to give two examples from across the ages, but two different words: the word pious and the Latin word virtus, that I think will be helpful in understanding what I mean about why it matters, whether we talk about Christian virtue or some other form of virtue. And first, the word pious. In the Aeneid, Aeneas says, "I am pious Aeneas. My fame is noted above the heavens." Now, if you cast your mind back over the Aeneid, what particularly pious thing has this man done over the course of this poem leading up to that statement? Right? I mean, he's a warmonger. He treats Dido something awful. He's not a great dude. But that's not why he's called pious. He's called pious because he carries Anchises on his back out of Troy. It's his duty to his father. And the fact that he won't proceed on his destiny without first going to the underworld to consult his father again, that's the basis of what piety is at that cultural moment that poem represents. Fast forward a bit, and we get the Virgin Mary called pious in kind of a unique sense. Because, well, Mary and Jesus, the two of them, have a sort of unique grab on piety, because piety then describes this tender devotion that exists between a parent and a child. And Mary is able to show to the one person, the babe at her breast, both the piety of a mother who loves her child and the piety of a worshiper who loves his God, and direct them at the same individual. And Jesus uniquely is able to show the piety of the Lord who cares dutifully for his subjects, as well as the ideal Son of God in a unique sense. And so now piety is shifting while having a connected meaning to that. You can see how the Christian vision of the ordering of loves is starting to control what's happening there. And then fast forward further to Dante, and when you come to pietà in Dante, which has to be translated both as pity and piety, right? And his pity is constantly getting him in trouble with Virgil in hell, because he's pitying those who don't deserve it. He's pitying the damned. And eventually Virgil just has to say, look, dude, in this place, pity lives when it is quite dead. Okay? The good pity here is not to have pity for these people. And then just after him, Tasso picks up on the tension in between piety between pietà as pity and piety in his Liberation of Jerusalem, when someone is pleading with the Christians to leave off the Crusades so they can go and rescue her kingdom, and actually she's a Muslim spy and sorceress who's in league with demons and is trying to undercut the whole crusade. And she appeals to their pity, which is a knightly chivalrous virtue that is of the highest order in that society. And Tasso has the Lord of the Christian host say, "You're right." She says, "Pity is never far from a noble breast." And he says, "You're right. But pity would piety undo if we were to leave off this enterprise that we began in the name of God." In Italian, it's pietà, pietà. Used both times, right? And you see the similar thing with virtue, where Aeneas is virtus. Virtus literally means manliness, right? What is great about virtue in the Aeneid? Aeneas is what a man should be. Aeneas killing Turnus at the end of the poem is according to the cultural understanding of what a man ought to be. But then when the ideal man shifts from Aeneas to Jesus, likewise, the word manliness shifts its meaning from something more like power to something more like what we mean by virtue today, right? And so I think it matters greatly what we propose for ourselves as our ideal that shapes what we see virtue as and how we're trying to train people up in virtue. Nevertheless, I think every school that's trying to train people up in virtue has more in common with each other than they do with schools that are trying to train them for some other purpose. But that commonality they have doesn't level out those real differences either.
Thank you for that, Junius. You're illustrating several things at once. One, the history of ideas, the literature, you know, that help us to trace out who we are and who we've become. And that's a part of what we do. I think what we're all trying to do in classical ed is understand who we are, where we've come from. And we do that through the reading of the tradition. Tradition is something that's been handed down. I want to get to a few more questions before we break. And we're at 15 minutes, and there's a couple more good questions for you. So whoever would like to, get ready to press the red button and answer the question. So this one is, do you believe the trivium, grammar, logic, rhetoric, should still be active in classical education?
Grammar, logic, and
I-
rhetoric, should it still be active in classical education?
Yes.
Just not as stages of development. If I can just put that out there, yeah, it should be. I mean, it's how we use words and how we understand words and understand ourselves through words and the world through words and how we articulate our thoughts. And so grammar, logic, and rhetoric as arts, as skills to be developed, absolutely needs to be part of what we do, but it needs to be part of what we do from when kids are 4 up when they're 44. I mean, grammar, logic, and rhetoric have to do with using language well and thinking well. So that's something we never abandon. I mean, but you know, as we all know, you know, I mean, it was not, you know, grammar, logic, and rhetoric were never stages of development in the classical tradition. That was clearly, you know, Dorothy Sayers, you know, kind of just riffing around and playing around with that. So I don't know. That's my quick answer. Yes.
Thank you.
I'll second that.
Martin, you got to weigh in on this because, and another question too that pigtails would piggyback with it, and that is, in your perspective, should classical education require the study of Latin? Why or why not? If yes, to what extent should a student in classical education master the Latin language? Before we get to you, Martin, Louis, in your essay, one of the 5 distinctives of classical education was being trivium based. Do you think that's important? Why?
Like I said, some people are going to define it slightly differently. And I agree, we don't have to necessarily follow Dorothy Sayers. But the one thing I think we do need is we have got to fight against this demonization of so-called rote memorization. When children are young, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, they not only love to memorize, they are equipped to do it. Down here in Houston, they say every student should learn Spanish. Well, that would be wonderful if we all knew Spanish, but they don't start until 6th grade. It's too late. If you want to learn Spanish, teach them at 1st grade. You think Europeans are that much more intelligent than we are? It's just that they start other languages in kindergarten, 1st grade, and they're able to speak it. And we're lucky if we can speak English. My daughter also speaks emoji. She's bilingual. But I do think that we have not got to be afraid of memorization. I love when I go speak at a classical school and the teacher will put her students through their little, their little rituals, and they start telling me the whole history of Europe and these beautiful things. That's wonderful. And it's not only laying down the foundation that they need, they enjoy doing it. The kids love it, right? So I think, again, we don't have to all do it the same way, but there has got to be an element of memorization in the grammar stage. And we absolutely must teach logic. If there's anything, logic, what do they teach them? That's what, of course, the professor says in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. What do they teach these children? They need to understand logical thinking, deduction, induction. They need to learn logical fallacies. And, that should be done throughout. But I think Dorothy Sayers is right that they're rather disputatious in middle school. So let's at least channel that in a good direction. And then rhetoric, I mean, our students, our classical students, if they can look you in the eye and speak, they're ahead of 90% of their fellow kids because they have the confidence to be able to defend a position, not be wishy-washy, but to be able to come forward and defend it and to understand worldviews and how they're consistent and coherent. So yes, I mean, like Brian, it doesn't have to be a lockstep that way, but those elements need to be there because they're all, and one thing, by the way, nobody said, I think it's implied in most of our articles, is classical education makes you a good citizen. We don't have to talk about nationalism, just to be a good citizen in a democracy or a republic, which is what we really are. You need to be able to think logically, to defend things. We've all heard this. How did people sit there and listen to the Lincoln-Douglas debates that apparently went on for 3 hours? And most of the people seemed to understand and could assess what was going on. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Lou. Yes, the trivium is here to stay. The threefold path. Martin,
I just want to say, Louis, there's no junior high I've ever been a part of has been as disputatious as faculty meetings at a university, though. So lest we throw junior high kids under the bus, I mean, go sit with a bunch of academics discussing anything that matters, or where to park. So,
Word.
Thank you, Martin. Should Latin be in a classical curriculum right now, and to what degree?
Well, I think, we all ought to aspire to have our students know Latin and Greek, and we just have to modulate that as our situations dictate. But well, just relate this to the previous question, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. We teach Latin because it's the best way to learn grammar. You need to learn grammar in another language. It's much easier to conceptualize that way, and it needs to be done in an inflected, highly inflected foreign language, which gets you down to German and Russian and Czechoslovakian and Greek and and Latin. And the advantage Latin has over all of those is that it's very regular. The rules almost always apply. It's very orderly, just like the Romans themselves. And so we use Latin to accomplish that first of the three linguistic liberal arts. And so Latin has a lot of benefits. It has mental benefits. In addition to being able to, read a primary source in Latin. Is that hard? Yes, it's hard, but there are programs that make that easier. And to be able to read something, read the Vulgate Bible. I read the Vulgate Bible for my gospel readings. That just does something for you. There's a sense of accomplishment that comes from that. If your students can do Latin, they have achieved a great thing, and I think they realize that.
Hey, Chris, can I add that? And I'd love to hear, Martin, your comment on this. And I'm not being disputatious here, but it's interesting and I commented on this recently at an Alcuin event in Virginia. When you read, say, Melanchthon on why learn Latin in the 16th century, the only argument is that it gives you access to the texts that aren't translated. And it gives you, it's your only way to read Virgil. It's your only way to read Augustine is to learn those kind of languages. Nobody that I've seen, at least from the longer tradition, makes the argument about it's a good way to learn the grammar of language, or it's a good mental discipline, or it's a good, there's a beauty of the language. I mean, if we want to make that case, I think that's fine, but that's not the reason people seem to learn Latin historically. They learn Latin historically because otherwise they didn't have access to the text. Now, I think your last point, I think you'd certainly see, and it's why, those of us theologians would learn Hebrew and Greek, because you want that kind of connection and contact with the original author.
Right. What nationality was Melanchthon again?
He was German.
Okay, well then he doesn't have some of the advantages that would accrue to us in our language, for one thing. Learned English is 60% Latinate. So in learning Latin, you're learning your own language, but it's not true German. It's not affected by Latin.
Yeah, that's fine. I would just say that for most of the tradition doesn't make that argument, and I think it's fine for us to make that argument. Just we should just recognize that we're making a different argument for the teaching of Latin, unless Chris
Well,
historic.
and let me say one more thing before Chris starts, and that is,
Okay.
I said it's the best way to learn grammar. I mean, if
Yeah.
we're serious about that first liberal art, then what's the best way to do that?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think hands down, Latin's the best way.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Well, and I think the key is that perhaps to agree somewhat with both of you, if I can try the third way thing here.
I think I agree with Martin. I'm not disagreeing with him.
Right.
I just wanted to get his comments.
Right. But the goal of learning Latin or any other language for that matter is not to translate, but to not have to translate, to become genuinely bilingual. So in fact, I've got a colleague who argues, for example, that Virgil is not particularly great literature in English translation. To read Virgil in English is sort of demoted the greatness of Virgil. There are other texts he would argue differently about Homer, for example. Whether you adopt his position or not, I think that the point that he's drawing upon is this: that the voice of Virgil, or of Cicero, or of the Latin Vulgate, for that matter, matters as it's expressed and formed and formulated by Cicero and by Virgil. And as an English speaker, or as a speaker of French or Spanish or whatever might be my native tongue, there is a huge benefit in accessing these texts, even if I can access them in translation, right? Because it gives me a different look at the world to understand the way that, I mean, languages organize reality differently. And so I see a different map on reality by reading something in Latin versus English.
Yeah, my example here for people is to read Shakespeare in translation. Right. I mean, for us native English speakers, that's our language. But you think of, what if I was reading Shakespeare in Czech? It'd be like, well, that's okay, but probably not the same experience, of reading him in English. And same with Dante, reading him in translation versus the medieval Italian, versus.
Right. The good news is there are lots of good reasons for studying Latin, and Melanchthon might not have had some of those good reasons in mind because they just weren't historically pertinent.
Right. So I'm not sure it would be. I'm agreeing with Brian, but I think I would just want to be clear to say, if we translate these texts into English, therefore we have graduated out of Latin and we now have access to the text. No, that's not true. And Brian, I don't think you were saying that. But just for the sake of clarification on what the point is.
But I guess my point is simply, if we say Latin because that's what we've always done in the classical tradition, I just want to say, well, but not for the same reason, perhaps, but maybe some of the same reasons, but not all the same reasons, because we might have new arguments like Martin has laid out there, and you.
Right.
Yeah, but it's just, that's an important point to note. Yeah, this particular point illustrates the ongoing natural organic evolution of education. There was a time when everything was taught in Latin, when in various countries times, people gathered, everybody was learning everything in Latin, including geometry. And there's only a few places where that's happening at all, and they're kind of eccentric now. So if you were to say, we aspire there in Arkansas at the Carrie School to teach everything in Latin in the next 10 years. We will be teaching geometry in Latin. That would be anachronistic. There would be no legitimate reason to do that now. But doing it in English is legitimate. Well, let's close with this. We just have 2 minutes before we go. If you were speaking to someone who was coming in new and was asking you the question, so tell me, you spent a large part of your career in classical education. What is it that you enjoy? Why do you stay in it? And you have to be quick because we only have 2 minutes, but why is it that you're doing what you're doing?
To hang out with my dead friends.
That was going to be my answer. Hang out with Junius.
Wait, I'm not dead yet.
Oh, yeah.
I say it's the best method for making virtuous, morally self-regulating citizens.
Saving
I
Western
do it because
civilization
it's
one student at a time.
Say that again.
Saving Western civilization one student at a time.
Sure.
I keep in it because I just get such joy out of learning new things.
The community of scholars and raising one too.
Heard recently
Care
somebody
about-
said,
Yeah, go ahead. Davies?
the last light that is being left on for Western civilization right now is the hope of raising a generation that can actually think well and love well. And I think that's a true, genuine passion that we all share.
I think the thing that I do that is the most important is reading with students and and studying together the great texts of literature and philosophy and political philosophy that lead them to ask the important questions about what makes them human and serious human beings.
I was going to say something similar, that the living seeds that are in the texts themselves, I can't get enough of that, but I love it in particular in the company of others, particularly students, but colleagues who are as, thirsty as I am.
One formulation I gravitate to is it chastens the manner and refines the soul.
Yeah. I was going to say something similar. The friendship, the collegiality, the second self that colleagues become who are also seeking the same true, good, and beautiful things creates a profound collegiality and friendship.
And then I would just say for me, it's just that sheer joy and delight that every educator knows when you see the light going on in a student. I mean, I'm doing senior exit interviews right now for my graduating university seniors. And just to see the difference in them from the first year they came in as freshmen to 4 years now, and then to staying in touch with those students that you taught 15 years ago and 20 years ago, and seeing how they live their lives differently because they read Dante with you, how they're functioning differently in their family because they learned Latin, what they're like in their churches because they went through Aristotle or they went through the Gospel of John. And seeing that, I mean, that I get chills thinking about that and thinking that, hey, I got to be the one that introduced them to that text, that conversation, and they're just seeing the impact. I mean, you're planting seeds and just watching them grow. And that is just, I mean, that's a good life's work right there, folks. And so I think that's what that keeps me going. And just my sheer delight of all this information. I mean, just all the stuff that we do. So
thank you, everyone. And we'll give it, those of you on the call who've been with us for the last 2 hours, would you mind just, as we're concluding tonight, just share your own thought in the chat box? Why is it, if you are doing classical education, what comes to mind as what brings you the greatest gratification? We'd love to see your thoughts too as we conclude. And we want to just thank you for spending this evening with us, and to all the panelists and essayists. Thank you too for your contribution and time. It's really been a great pleasure. Hope to see you in a quarter from now, and we'll talk about the canon of the great books, etc.
Chris, and I think our conversation now just illustrates that part of what we do is just we converse with one another, because this could go on. I mean, this could go on for hours, and this is picking up on conversations most of us have had together at some point in time over the past, few years. And so that's what it means to be part of a tradition. So, which is a beautiful thing too.
Yeah, ongoing conversation. And just reading some of the thoughts here. I thirst for more, says Katie Ruth, feeding the souls of students with what they are hungry for. That this was missing in my youth. To transmit the good, the true, the beautiful to the next generation. Christ, being surrounded by people who thirst for more love. And our students, to build bridges, heal divides. Latin and Greek for a strong mind, and the great books for a free soul. Godly character, lifelong learners. Meaning of life with students, teaching truth. Redeeming my education as I educate my children. That's a great reason to become
Yep.
an educating parent. And thank you, everyone, once again, for being with us. And with that, we'll say good night and God bless you.